Episode 47, October the 31st to November the 1st, 1914. Bloodbath of London Scots. Immortal Story of a Territorial Regiment. By Private Herbert de Hamel. Read by Colin Mackenzie. The 1st London Territorial Battalion to engage the enemy were the London Scottish, who came into action near Messines during the First Battle of Ypres. They bore the brunt of the fiercest German attacks with the utmost gallantry. Surrounded on three sides, they fought to the bitter end, losing 345 men, but accounting for hundreds of Germans. The wonderful story of pluck and endurance which follows was written by a survivor who, though wounded, succeeded with his officer and 8 other ranks in eluding capture. The London Scottish were warmly congratulated for their gallantry. October the 31st, 1914. Our captain called us round him. The British front was hard pressed, he said, and the Scottish were to take up a position with the regulars. They were relying on us to hold back the Germans from our little bit of front. He wisely made no effort to disguise the seriousness of the situation or the danger ahead of us. He congratulated us on the honour that had been bestowed on us, and expressed his firm belief that the regiment would hold out till ordered to retire. Shortly after the battalion had marched out of Saint-Éloi, it left the high road and went across country till it reached a low-lying hill, with its steep side covered with trees, bracken and brambles. Here we were halted and told to lie down. The air was full of drowsy rumbling and muttering of guns. The sound was a distant one, but full of a strange uneasiness. Personally, I found myself wishing that it was either a long way farther off or a long way nearer. I rolled over and went to sleep, and was awakened by my right ankle sliding down the slope, followed by the rest of my anatomy. The banging of the guns sounded far closer. I don't know if I'd been dreaming of Germans, but I was by no means sorry to hear a cheery voice cry, "Wake up, old son, we're falling in." We marched down a grassy road between trees stripped of their bark and with their trunks strangely fluted and grooved by bullets. Then on past a prosperous-looking farm, tenanted by incongruously ragged folk, who reaped a harvest of discarded articles at our next halt. From this, a German aeroplane drove us to the cover of a wood. No sooner had I settled down for another sleep than we were off again, followed by the aeroplane, till we reached the village of Ch6. The battalion passed through, I believe, safely, all save the last company. On our right were houses. On our left was a steep bank, upon which rose the church tower. Big shells began to fall all around us. The first 2 pitched beyond us, the next 3 crashed amongst the houses, throwing up clouds of dust, smoke and debris, and the next one hit the church tower. The sight of the peasants running away down the main street in panic brought home the tragic side of the bombardment. A second shell struck the church tower, or part of the roof, and the fragments blew over us. Matters were becoming unpleasantly warm, when a staff officer struck by an idea, and he waved us to advance. As we marched up the street, a house was shattered with a deafening noise close to the section in front of us. At this point occurred, I believe, the first casualties the regiment sustained. Some were carried into cellars of the houses, and others handed over to a section of native stretcher-bearers that waited by us. Then on went the company across fields, where picks and shovels lying on the grass spoke of a hasty scattering under shrapnel in the open, till we reached the rest of the battalion, standing close by in a hedge-bordered wood, waiting motionless every time a Taube sailed over us. Behind the shelter of the hill we adopted column formation. The companies extended one by one and marched over the brow. Bullets began to fly pretty thickly over us, and they and the shrapnel grew more and more frequent as company after company breasted the ridge. As our company, the last one, came over the top, we could see our battalion ahead of us. The first two companies had closed and were lying down behind the next ridge. The others advanced in extended lines below us. The distance and the dressing were more perfect than any field day inspection at home. The lines marched steadily onwards through the routes. At last we reached dead ground, closed and lay down. Once again the companies rose, extended, and passed over the brow of this second hill into what must have been a very blizzard of bullets. In front of us sat Colonel Malcolm, chatting calmly to a staff officer. Every now and then he glanced half anxiously along our line to see how we were taking it. Near him sat two burly lifeguardsmen, keeping watch and ward over a condemned man. It was he, a surly, black-bearded peasant, who had worked the sails of a windmill, and so brought down the big shells on Ypres. This little attention had, I am told, been intended for the Lincolns, who passed through the village ahead of us. I cannot vouch for this. All I can vouch for is that the shells were duly delivered. Just as our turn came to follow on over the hill, a staff officer ran up on our left and pointed back in the direction whence we had come, wherefore the senior subaltern took his half-company off in this new quarter. At first we were under cover. Then shell holes appeared in the ground and bullets began to pass us. One man sat down and commenced to bandage his legs, his expression one of surprised indignation. Eventually we came upon an open road and lay down in the ditch on the near side. It was a very shallow ditch, and we started to dig ourselves in. A sudden increase in the output of shrapnel puzzled me, till I realized that the senior subaltern had strolled along to our end of the ditch. He lay down and told us he wanted 10 men to come with him to occupy a small trench in front of us. This had been held by Indian troops till their officers had been killed. When the noise had quieted down, he took his 10 men with him. We jumped up and started to double forward. "I think we better walk, it looks better," he remarked. So we walked towards a haystack that gave us some cover from sight. Once past this, things became more lively, and our CO took us on the double. For several hours there was an almost incessant din and concussion of shells. All through that inferno I was held by the pluck of the man next to me. In the very worst moments he was bright and as cheery as usual habit of life. He must have felt afraid, as of course we all did, but he showed no sign of it. After one particularly lively outburst of assorted shells, he remarked, "I suppose that after a couple more days we should go back to the reserve trench." "Probably this is the reserve trench," I said, "and tomorrow we should get into the real thing." "You always were a cheery blighter," replied Bugler Dunlop, and we both laughed. 2 days later I was told of his death out in the open. About 5 o'clock the shelling ceased. The unnatural calm was broken only by the sound of occasional British shells and their distant explosion. An officer in the native regiment came up to me and asked where he could find the officer in command. I directed him to our senior subaltern. In the dim light he must have mistaken the star for a crown, as he saluted our CO respectfully and urged him to retire to a position in the rear of our trench, which the latter he described as the worst shell trap in all the line. Our CO replied that he had orders to hold the trench till the last possible moment, and that he intended so doing. The captain shrugged his shoulders. "Very well, sir. Of course, if you insist on staying here, I will do nothing except hold my ground to support you." He saluted and turned away. We had deepened the trench and scooped out hollow caves, but there was no cover in the event of enfilade fire. I was soon hard at work with the others in hewing a traverse at right angles to the end of our trench. It was very slow work, and after a long period with only room for one man to work at a time, we had progressed about 4 or 5 feet to a depth of about 5 feet, and from that point the traverse ran up to ground level in a gentle slope. Then I ceased digging to take my hour spell at looking out. Two of us stood side by side, peering into the patchwork of moonlight and shadow, straining our eyes for the least movement. Bullets fitted over us, past us, and between us. I felt heartily thankful when my spell came to an end. Our CO, who could have rested comfortably under cover, shared the whole watch of each successive pair of lookouts. I debated whether to enlarge my little cave or to enjoy my oft-postponed sleep. I decided on the latter course. I was no sooner curled up than the order came to stand to. A terrific rattle and cackle of rifle and Maxim fire broke out. Away in front of us, a line of dim figures advanced, ghost-like, in the moonlight. The CO told us to prepare to fire, but to wait for the command. "Who are you?" shouted the CO. There was no answer, and he repeated the question. As this met with no reply, he sang out to us to open fire. We blazed away into them, and wondered why they lay down in twos and threes to fire back. Then it struck us, suddenly, they were tumbling over. They made no attempt to rush us, but still advanced at a steady walk, falling as they came. Flashes spat out along their line, but there was no sound or shout or cry, only the crackling of rifle shots. The bullets cut through the hedge in front of us and slapped into the bank behind us as the line came on, and all the while our new rifles jammed and stuck. It might be after one shot or after 5 shots that we dropped to the bottom of the trench and tugged and banged at the bolt to get it free. Then, as often as not, it would foul the next cartridge from the magazine and refuse to click home. And all the while the dim line was advancing. I'm told that all the rifles in the battalion were condemned and exchanged for new ones very shortly afterwards. After a while there were no more Germans walking towards us, though the heavy firing continued somewhere in the near neighbourhood. Our casualties were a sergeant and a lance corporal, each, I believe, hit in the eyes. They were taken into the rear in the lull which followed. At the time I imagined this silence to mean the German attack had been repulsed, but according to the fighting territorials, the British line had retired under orders to take up a new position, and the message did not reach the Carbineers or the Scottish, who were consequently surrounded and cut off, and had to fight their way through. I can speak only of what occurred to our own little party. To our left, a light showed in the window of a house in the village. Other lights appeared in other windows, grew into a blaze, and turned red. Flames poured out and burst through the roof. This happened in several houses, till the village was in flames. There was still firing going on, and we waited to see if anything else would happen. It did. There came a sound of great cheering. "We're charging," shouted the CO. "Get ready to join in." Some way behind the trench, a building blazed brightly. Silhouetted against this, a crowd of dark figures ran past in a curious, shambling gait. Each man in the same mould, bent forward under the weight of a heavy pack, and crowned with a spiked helmet. It was not our men charging. These men were advancing in the wrong direction. "They're after the Carbineers," said the CO. "Double out and open fire on them. We'll try to draw them off, to give our poor beggars a chance to make a stand." I stopped behind long enough to grab an extra couple of bandoliers and doubled out after the others. Moonlight is a deceptive form of illumination, and I lay down in a careful alignment with a row of turnip tops and opened fire. After a while it occurred to me that I might be masking the fire of the man next to me. I jumped up and ran back instead of crawling, and I was lying down again. The old proverb about more haste and less speed hit me a bang in the ribs and thigh with a red-hot poker, and I sat over backwards instead. Then somebody discovered that the Germans were coming up a solid mass behind us, so the others doubled back to hold the trench. The people we had fired on turned on us and were also advancing, and a third lot were bearing down on us to enfilade us. I got onto my feet and proceeded to hunt diligently for a clip of cartridges, which I dropped. I was festooned with bandoliers and my pouches were full of ammunition, but that clip was the one thing that mattered. Had I hunted about for my sporran, which contained all my worldly wealth, there would have been some sense in the proceeding. But I had not realized that the bullet which tore away my water bottle had also robbed me of my sporran, leaving in place an enormous charred hole in my greatcoat. When I returned to the trench, I sat on the floor. Fortunately, there was not a lot of room to lie down, or I should perforce have remained in that position. The others were firing over both sides of the trench. The Germans blazed away to us from 3 sides. There was just one solid round of bullets, a steady wail of changing notes. The junior subaltern, looking back from the ridge, saw a ring of fire around the trench and gave us up for lost. The other sergeant's rifle jammed permanently. He took mine, but it had jammed also. Then, good fellow that he was, he cut off my greatcoat and my serge to get at my side. Thereby I lost many treasured possessions in exchange for a small avalanche of sand. Before he could get at my first aid bandage, the garrison began to evacuate the position. Matters had been hopeless a second before. Then, so I am told, the smoke from a burning stack blew over the trench and hid it from sight after the most approved mythological fashion. I groped for my coat. I groped for my serge, but I could not find them. They were very precious to me, but time was more precious still. Wherefore I left them sadly and, holding on to my kilt, climbed the easy slope of the thrice-blessed Traverse and joined the CO, who had stopped to make quite sure that all his men were out. We then made for a high hedge in front of us. The party scattered a little. The sergeant and some of the men found a sunken road and reached our lines in safety. When we reached the fence, the fire opened again. I found a gate and shouted to the others. We went through it and ran into another party of advancing Germans. Turning sharply back along the other side of the fence, we passed through a farmyard, unseen by the men who were inside the house, setting fire to it. Then we reached a 9-foot fence with barbed wire strung through it. The others went over it like a troop of professional monkeys. The CO hailed me softly from the far side, and refused to go on without me. I cursed him inwardly because the muscles in my right side were not intact, and had not even considered the question of gymnastic effort. I managed to climb up the wires with 2 feet and 1 hand, reached the top, and took a header down into the dark. The CO fielded me, and we sat down together in a heap. In the next field we ran across a company of German soldiers advancing in line upon our left. On our right was a hedge, so we were forced to keep straight on. The moonlight was brilliant. We could see their uniforms, their faces, and their pickelhaubes, and we could hear them talking together. Our men's bayonets were gleaming on the ends of their rifles, and we must have been as plainly visible to them as they to us. They made no attempt to rush us, and let us reach a road about 200 yards away. Then they opened fire on us, and I can only conclude that they deliberately waited till they were out of reach of our bayonets before molesting us. Our seer was so indignant about it that he was with great difficulty restrained from hurling himself and his 9 able-bodied followers at them with the bayonet. He left the place with the utmost reluctance, but although a sudden charge might have thrown that company into confusion, the place was crawling with additional Germans. We walked down a road between small trees and struck out again across the country. In front of us lay a village. An enormous shell came rattling and snorting over us as we approached the village. It burst into a blaze of light, and the houses became instantly a mass of flames. 3 more shells followed, and 2 minutes later the whole place was a furnace. We turned back. After a while we found ourselves on a road with high banks and walked along it. I had dropped back a little behind the others, and so first heard a wild rattle of hoofs on the road. I shouted a warning. There was a Ulan coming. They promptly ambushed. A cloaked figure galloped around the corner and pulled his horse back on his haunches as he suddenly found himself looking down 9 rifle barrels and 2 bayonets which had jammed and refused to come unfixed. I think they were both relieved and disappointed, but he turned out to be a corporal in the household brigade, riding for reinforcements. He told us the Germans had simply poured over his regiment and broken through, and that the day was lost. He pointed out in the direction of Ypres, then set his spurs into his charger and galloped on again. Following his instructions, we struck out across a dreary open plain, intersected by water dikes for all the world like the Norfolk marshes. As we approached the high road on the far side of the marshes, we saw a signal lamp winking from the base of a windmill, but as we knew not if the place was held in force by the enemy, or the flashes were the work of a spy, or if they owed their being to one of our own signallers, we decided to make inquiries before we entered the village beyond. Accordingly, we halted on the road a little way out. We had not long to wait before a motor car approached us. It stopped, and found it was driven by an English soldier who had told us that there was a staff officer and a dressing station close by. The CO turned me over to the dressing station and then hurried to report to the staff officer. From there, he and his 9 men joined in, I believe, with the force that stormed Messines a few hours later.